Hello, and today we're going to talk about how to debrief your NewsMatch campaign and learn from it and make your next campaign even better. My name is Will Warren. I'm the Senior Revenue Growth Specialist at the News Revenue Hub. If you're not familiar with what we do, we are a nonprofit that supports newsrooms in growing their audiences and membership revenue with both technology and consulting services. So, we are going to talk about debriefing a campaign, but first, I think we need to say why you should debrief a campaign. I know that come January 1st, it might be that you know how much you made, but you're kind of ready to be done with your campaign. You've put in a lot of work. You're ready to move on to your next project, your next priorities. But I think it's really critical to understand not only how your campaign performed, but why it went the way that it did, because that is where growth is ultimately going to come from, is understanding what's driving success, what are areas for improvement, and then coming up with theories or tests or ideas that you can implement to make your next campaign build on the one you just did, rather than just sort of like continually recycling or rehashing what you've always done. And to my mind, there's really like three steps to a campaign debrief. The first is collecting the correct data. That's something that you obviously need to do at the outset. It's very hard to backtrack and get this data, but we'll talk about which data points are important to track. Then you analyze the data and you can compare it to your past performance or your expectations, maybe both. And then you take those insights and try to turn them into actionable ideas that you can implement in the year ahead. So when we talk about your data points, these are the ones that I think are the most important for a campaign debrief. Some of these are really intuitive, and I think every single donation processing platform will collect them, like donation amount, the date, the frequency. Those are all very obvious. But the one I would especially circle is donation source. This is the difference between being able to say, we raised $12,000 this year versus we raised $12,000 and 3,000 of it was from email number one and 1,500 was from the website and $65 came from social media and on and on. That level of specificity is really, really valuable when you are trying to come up with theories about why your performance was what it was and what you can change or implement or continue or avoid in the future to build on that success. Um, Being able to differentiate between new and existing donors is also very valuable because new donors are so important. And your audience size, both like web traffic and your newsletter size, are really important contextual points, because while the tactics that you implement and the things you do and the messaging you use obviously drive a lot of your campaign's performance, so too does your audience size. If your list is much bigger, you might make more. If your web traffic is way down, you might make less. And so that's a useful contextual data point as well. So once you have that data in hand, you should then think about everything that you did during the NewsMatch campaign. So from here on out, we're going to sort of like pretend we have this example campaign that I have some data for that we'll look at. And so for our campaign, we're going to say we sent 6 emails, just like we did in 2024. We had the same CTAs on the website, but we added a new one, especially specifically on Giving Tuesday. We use the same toppers in our newsletters. We updated the language, but they're like basically the same. And we made a few asks on social media, just like we did last year. So that's sort of our example campaign, but broadly, you should compile every way that you asked for money and have those all ready for your analysis. And from here, we want to think about what our expectations were. So hopefully at the outset of your campaign, you set a goal and you had something of a theory of how you would achieve that goal. If you didn't do that, that's okay. You can look at all those assets you just compiled and say, like, well, what did we reasonably expect had them to do? It might be that your expectations are based largely or entirely on your previous campaign's performance, or it might be based on things that you did that were new or different or you had observed and that you expected them to have a difference maker in your campaign. So for our example, like I said, we sent 6 emails just like we did last year, but our list grew. So we expected to make a little bit more money from the same amount of emails because they were going to more people. We also experimented with a graphical email, so an email that was just an image rather than text. That was email number 2 for our campaign this year. And we know that's the best practice. So we thought that that would do better than a normal email. So we expect it to grow there. And like I said, we added a new CTA below our articles on Giving Tuesday. And we, of course, expect that to be an increase in revenue because we didn't do it at all last year. So those are sort of the things that we thought were going to drive our campaign's performance beyond what we did in 2024, because largely our campaign was pretty similar to 2024. So then you have all your data, you have your assets, you have your expectations about how they will perform, and so now it's time to begin to look at the data. For the purposes of this, I've grouped all the revenue by source and by year. So you can see email 6, the one we sent on the last day of the campaign. In 2024, it made just under $1,400, and in 2025, it made just under or just over $1,500, and then that's repeated for every campaign element. I then calculated the difference between 2025 and 2024. So if it's a positive number, that means we made more from that asset this year than we did last year. And if it is negative, we made less. This is, for the purposes of explaining, very simple. In most cases, you probably won't have a one-to-one comparison for every single thing you did. So you might want to group revenue together and say, well, this is how much all of our emails made. This is how much the website made. And things like that, where there may not be a direct analog, but for our purposes, we've just sort of replicated everything one-to-one, with the exception of this Giving Tuesday unit. So once we have this, and this understanding of how things performed relative to last year, we can start to see how that did or didn't align with our expectations, and if anything else is striking to us. So the first thing that I see is obviously this big difference maker here was this Giving Tuesday below article unit. I expected it to make more this year than last year because it didn't exist last year, but $740 is quite significant. So on one day. So this strikes me as a major success for the campaign, not necessarily an unexpected one, but maybe the degree to which it happened was unexpected. I'll say, these are all examples. The things I'm talking about tend to be best practices, but this is made up data for the purposes of this exercise. The next thing I'm going to look at is, like I said, our list has grown slightly, but our email strategy was largely the same, with the exception of that one graphical appeal. So we expected to make more from the emails, sort of in relation to or directly attributed to our newsletter's growth. And what I can see here is that emails are all up about 10%. And so if our list grew 10%, we would say, okay, that makes sense. We didn't try anything too new with these emails 3, email 5, email 1, but the list grew, and so the revenue grew as well. And so that is a sign that the language we use is probably about as effective as last year, and we're enjoying the benefits of list growth. We see that as well in the newsletters, the newsletter toppers, where we saw that similar growth. Then I'm going to start to look at some of the things that didn't perform as well relative to last year, and maybe relative to my expectations as well. So newsletter topper 3, the other newsletter toppers did better. This one did worse. So I might look at the language of that and see, was there something that was different or ineffective about that? But the big surprise for me as I'm looking at this is email number 2. So this was our graphical appeal. We expected it to do better, and it did much worse than last year. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at that graphical appeal to try to understand why that is, especially before concluding, oh, well, graphical appeals don't work. I'm going to go ahead and look at what that is. So you continue to sit with the data, ask these questions of why did this happen? How did this meet our expectations, best practices, going back and looking at the assets to try to answer those questions. And once you have your observations and your theories and your hypotheses, it becomes time to translate those into action for your next campaign. And this is what transitions your campaign from being, or your debrief from being a bunch of fun facts to something that's actually useful. So this is the difference between saying email 5 made $86 more this year than last year, and that's one of the reasons why we made $1,300 more dollars than we did last year. It's the difference between saying that and saying email 5 did better for this reason, and we're going to replicate that in our next campaign so that every email does that much better. So continuing with our example campaign, these are some ways that I might translate some of these ideas into action. So the first thing is that I think we should rework our graphical email. Like I said, one takeaway might be that this just doesn't work with our audience, but in this fictional world, we might have looked back at it and realized that it didn't really have a prominent donate button. It was just the image, but it didn't have the strong call to action piece missing that was missing. And so we want to try it again in our next campaign with that prominent button to see, is it really that just like this style of appeal doesn't work with our audience, or was it a design flaw that we can eliminate and then enjoy the benefits of this, strong appeal type? Another example is that we can consider expanding the use of our below article CTA. So, like I said, we added this thing on Giving Tuesday and it made $740. Giving Tuesday is obviously a special day. People are more likely to give on Giving Tuesday than they are on other days. So it's not like I would expect this to make $740 a day during a campaign. But my question is, since it was so successful, should we cordon it off to one day, or what would it look like if we did it for a whole campaign? Would people eventually get used to it and grow tired of it? Potentially, but I think that there's still a lot of untapped revenue here. And so I want to try that during a campaign. And then finally, something that was more of like it was the absence of something than the presence of something, was that checks were like largely flat. And we really didn't, in our example campaign, do anything different to try to get checks. We just sort of send out our appeals and let the checks come in as people saw fit to send them in. But what if we did something to try to initiate or get people to contribute with checks? And so my idea from looking at this data point where checks were largely flat, which like makes sense because we didn't change anything. What if we changed something? And what if we, in the footer of our emails, said, prefer to give by check? Here's our mailing address, or we include it as a PS. Would we see more check revenue? Would we inform people that there's more ways to give and drive, make it easier for folks to give and therefore get more money? Seems like a strong hypothesis. That's also best practice. And one that I'd like to try in my next campaign. And so that's how we translate, again, this list of facts of here's how this did and here's how this did to something actionable. I now have 3 ideas that I can try in my next campaign and see if they work. We have strong reason to think that each of them would, but we'll repeat this process again at the end of the next campaign. If these things were as successful as we hope they are, then that becomes a part of our campaign playbook. If not, maybe we tinker again, maybe we abandon it if we've come to the conclusion that it's really just not working. But this is the process for turning your observations into ideas. And then finally, this is a very simple and high level example of what a campaign debrief would look like. So I want to hit on a few more like useful tips or important points for when you're doing your debrief. The first of these is that recurring gifts are really important. Oftentimes a monthly gift is just worth more over the course of 12 months than a one-time gift, but especially when you take into account how much easier it is to retain revenue that auto renews versus a one-time gift, these gifts become really, really valuable. And so it's important that you value them appropriately. You might want to annualize monthly gifts, so multiply them by 12 to account for that, year-long value of them, so that when you compare them to one-time gifts, it's more of an apples-to-apples comparison. But even aside from that, when you're looking at your sources of revenue, you might want to look at, just how many recurring gifts did each one generate and weigh that in its analysis. So, for example, we might say email 1 did pretty well. It wasn't the best email, but it was solid. But if we see that it generated a lot of recurring donations, we might say, well, what in that language specifically was so effective at getting recurring donations, and can we use it elsewhere? Similarly, you want to look at the average gift amount, and especially look for really large gifts in your debrief, because a single large gift can really throw off your analysis. If you look at email 1, and conversely, if it was, we were saying like, okay, this is pretty solid, but it came from one person who gave $802. That's very different from, it coming from 10 people who each gave $80. And so when you're thinking about how effective or successful was something, it's important to sort of calibrate it based on if there are any large gifts that you receive. Large gifts, of course, count, but those are oftentimes personally solicited. They're less likely to happen in exactly the same way as they happened in the previous year. So it would be, maybe unrealistic to say, oh, our average email makes $1,000 if that's really heavily dependent in one single campaign on large gifts versus you might feel more confident saying our average email makes $1,000 if it was all gifts under $500, for example. And then finally, it's really important to consider the sources of new donors. So just like when you're thinking about sources of recurring donations, your new donors are the folks who are going to grow your membership program. And so it's really important to pay special attention to what language motivated those folks to give, what sources led to their donations, and so on, because these are folks of special interest that you want to focus on. So with that, good luck with your NewsMatch campaigns, and good luck debriefing them when they're all done.